today's show, we're going to be talking to two people who are activists in mental health care. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dan Fisher. Dan is a person who has recovered from schizophrenia. He was hospitalized several times prior to becoming a psychiatrist. He is one of the few psychiatrists in the country who publicly discusses his recovery from mental illness. He is a role model for others who are struggling to recover, and his life dispels the myth that people do not recover from mental illness. His recovery and work in the field were recognized by his selection as a member in the White House Commission on Mental Health. Dr. Fisher is a speaker, teacher, and researcher who travels to all parts of the country to conduct workshops, give keynote addresses, teach classes, and organize conferences for consumers and survivors, families, and mental health providers to promote the recovery of people labeled with mental illness by incorporating the principles of empowerment. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you very much, Barbara.
You're welcome. Next, I'd like to introduce Lauren Spiro, who as a teenager was hospitalized for over a year and diagnosed as having chronic schizophrenia. She recovered from this severe emotional distress and for 30 years kept publicly silent about having been a survivor. During those 30 years, she served as a Peace Corps volunteer and worked in the mental health system as a direct service provider, program director, clinician, supervisor, senior manager, consultant, and trainer. A lot of hats. She learned about healing from the recovery community and reemerged as a mental health client, reclaiming her dignity and integrity. She strives to be a role model and an inspiration for people working on their own recovery process. Welcome, Lauren. Pleasure to have you. I'd like to start talking with you, Dan. You have a unique background as a psychiatrist. Can you tell us about yourself and what led you to do this work?
Sure, I'd be glad to. I actually originally was a biochemist and was working at the National Institute of Mental Health on, of all things, the supposed neurochemistry of schizophrenia when I was in my 20s. And it was during the course of that work that I myself became diagnosed with schizophrenia. And I completely changed my perspective and my view about what this condition or this label was about. I had previously gone into the laboratory because I thought it was caused primarily by neurotransmitters or biological defects. But from my own life experience of having been, I was hospitalized on 3 occasions, and I went into innumerable types of therapy and peer support. And what I found was most important in my recovery was not medication and was not a belief that it was a biological brain disorder, but was really about relationships and following my dreams and finding meaningful work. And I was very, very fortunate that I had a psychiatrist who always went with what I felt was most important, and very minimal use of medication. Not that I'm opposed to medication, but at least in my situation and in a lot of people's lives, the relationships are more important. And the relationship with my psychiatrist was very important. He always believed in me, and my family believed in me, and my friends believed in me. And it was during my second hospitalization that I decided that I should myself become a psychiatrist and get the keys and open up the doors and let people out of these infernal psychiatric hospitals, which I still, 40 years later, am working to try to create alternatives to. It's just a horrible experience to be locked into a psychiatric hospital. You know when you're going to get out, you know exactly why you're there. There's never really any justice. You have no rights. Your dignity is trampled upon. And but what I found was I couldn't do it alone, so I've now become a advocate.
I think I remember hearing you once tell a story about how there was someone that made some sort of a relationship connection with you, not necessarily a higher up person in the hospital, but one of the lower
corpsman.
Yes.
Yes.
Who just, was sort of there for you, present.
Well, that's yeah. You're referring probably to just at the beginning of my second hospitalization. I was in the public health service, but my hospitalization was to be at a Navy hospital, Bethesda Naval Hospital, and my particular way of dealing with stress was to withdraw, as it is for some people, into my own world, and it was really a way of finding safety, and then to make matters feeling more unsafe, I was wheeled into an emergency room at the Navy hospital, and I was not going to talk, and they typically, have their notebook and they're like, tell me, what's your name? And I was dropped off by my friends with no identification, so they didn't even know my name. They didn't know my, social security number. They didn't know rank, anything. They just knew I was supposed to be there. So it's true, the higher up, more trained people just gave up. They put me in a wheelchair, wheeled me into a corner, and there was a corpsman, the least trained people, and we often find this, they're able to use their heart. And he just looked at me the longest time, and I don't know how long it was, but I noticed he was really looking right at me, and my eyes were open. He said, we don't know whether you can hear us or not, because I hadn't said a word. But if you can hear me, just nod. And I nodded, and then he said, you seem to be in a lot of distress. And my name is Rick. And it actually is the reason we do this program, which we will have to tell you about. Emotional CPR. It's the reason.
So that's when you discovered the magic of how relationships can
That's
really
right.
heal.
Heart to heart. My heart to your heart. To Lauren's heart. And we just don't have enough of it in this world. We're too bottled up in our mind. And it's really people's heart that is essential.
Can you tell us about your work on George W. Bush's new Freedom Commission?
Sure. I was surprised that I was appointed a member because I've always spoken out and questioned the traditional system. Somehow I got on, though. And I think partly it might have been because they wanted to have their fulfillment of a quota of somebody, a consumer. And I was seen by them as a more acceptable consumer because I was a psychiatrist who was a consumer. So I think that might have been part of it. I had a devil of a time because I was the only person labeled with a psychiatric problem. Others had problems, but out of 15. And my one major intent, though, and for everyone I felt I was representing, was to get recovery into that report. That would be the vision, that people could recover. And I'm proud to say that report has as its vision statement, we see a future where everyone labeled with a mental illness will recover. Everyone. And that it'll be driven, that recovery, the new system will be driven by people's own experience, people who've been through our experience. So it was stressful, but it was worth it.
And may I just add something that I found very inspirational, and I imagine other people do when you talk about your work on the commission, that the question was, well, how could you do it? And I know you did a few things, like have a lot of people testify, but you've also spoken about the importance, I know it's meant a lot to me, the importance of establishing relationships with the other commissioners. They got to know you as a human being, and that changed, I think, the perceptions of some of those commissions?
Yeah, the social time that we had. We met 12 times. We met monthly for about 3 or 4 days, but it was the away from camera, away from the public arena. When we had lunch or we had dinner together, it's true, I would get to know them, and then they started, and several became what I call converts. There's one woman who tells me, she was on the commission, she said, I never believed people would recover, but by gosh, you really did recover.
People don't believe it.
Yeah, she was from Texas. She said, and I tell people, I know somebody who's labeled with schizophrenia who recovered.
Yeah.
It's too bad it's still seen as such an oddity, though. And that's one reason why, though I don't want to harp on the fact that I was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and I have a lot of questions about that label. People still are being diagnosed with it and are still being told that they don't have a future, and that nothing could be further from the truth. Many people recover, but they don't generally go out and say, I was labeled with schizophrenia and recovered. They go, I'm going to get a job and get the hell out of here. But I feel it's important that people know there is a future, there is hope, and it's not a death sentence. It can be a beginning, actually, a learning experience.
Wow. You're the executive director of the National Empowerment Center.
That's
Can you
correct.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. The National Empowerment Center is funded primarily by SAMHSA, Substance Abuse Mental Health Administration, which is a branch of our federal government, and it's on a competitive basis. We've won grants for nearly every one of the last 19 years, and our mission is really to bring recovery and hope and wellness to all people, not only who have been labeled, but could be labeled, which really is everyone, because it could happen to anyone. I know people don't like to hear that. So we put together materials such as, I mentioned earlier, this Emotional CPR, to try to give people tools so that they can get through emotional difficulties and not have to fall into the system, and get deeper in it. And we also network people together, and we do policies such as working on the commission.
Lauren, you have a very interesting history too. You were diagnosed with chronic schizophrenia and recovered, and were silent about it for 30 years. Can you tell us a little bit about how you recovered?
Well, first, thank you for asking. First, I want to share the silence. The reason for the silence was shame. I wanted to, if you can imagine being 16 and 17, I just wanted to belong. And to have that label was absolutely terrifying. When I learned about the label, it was scary. Psycho went through my mind that I was that person. So the silence was out of shame. That, I was told that I had an incurable brain disease. And I remember very distinctly in my early 20s thinking, how do you know? Because there was no, and as far as I know, there still isn't any definitive test. They're saying my brain was different and it would never be normal. It was very painful, and I felt very isolated, and it's not something I would go out and tell my friends. I was afraid that I would lose my friends, and so I stayed silent for almost, 30 years. So working in the system, but not revealing that I had been on the other side. I had been behind the locked doors and in the seclusion room, and it was about 20 years ago, I met some people who had recovered and were actually critical of the system. And at the time, I couldn't really hear it. I just thought, oh, they're just those radical people that, And I thought that I was the expert, and I knew I had been trained as a clinician, and I had been through the experience myself. And quite frankly, I was a bit arrogant about it and naive. So it took me a few years to finally start listening to some of these people that had recovered, and Janet Foner used to talk about how medication was actually damaging and it was bad for you, and I remember saying, but, I thought it helped me. It helped me sleep, and I couldn't imagine how I could recover. if I couldn't sleep, if I couldn't get some rest. And then a couple years later, I remember hearing something that just absolutely shocked me. That I was in a support group at a workshop, a weekend workshop. And again, questioning, what happened to me, and do I really have a chronic brain disease? And I had been on and off medication for 20 years, on psychiatric medication, on and off. And I remember one day, it was just so shocking to me that Janet said to me, there was never anything wrong with you. And I just looked at her and I said, what are you talking about? I have this label, I was in the hospital, and I just, I had been in and out of therapy, probably similar to you, Dan, and I felt like I had tried everything I knew to do to try and find my genuine self. Even though I had a job, I had a good job, good home, the car, I looked like I was leading the comfortable middle-class life, but I always felt like something was missing. So I thought, what do I have to lose? Let me try, maybe, to wrap my mind around the possibility that nothing was ever wrong with me. It was like, let me just try that on. And literally, I spent a few years thinking about it, doing some emotional release work on it, and it took a few years before I could even begin to believe that maybe it was true. So it was just a lot of self-exploration, and over the years I really came to embrace it.
So after you were hospitalized for in your teens, I guess,
yes,
and you were released from the hospital, then were you able to resume school and education and so forth, where you had left off before?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah, absolutely. I went back to a public high school. There was a school in the mental institution, a very tiny school. But yeah, I went back to public school. My counselor, I was a senior. I had one semester left as a senior. The counselor assured me that he wouldn't reveal my secret. It was all about secrecy. I went back to a different public high school than the one I had had a year and a half earlier. Still in the same community, and of course everyone in the community at my high school knew what happened, But yeah, it was this, secrecy. And I'll be honest with you, my family, my siblings, to this day, never once have asked me anything about what happened. It was just this, let's sweep it under the table. I know they love me and I know they care, but I think it's that fear. People don't know what to say. I know when I came home, they were afraid that to do anything that would push me over the edge. So this was all part. You can understand why I went silent and wanted to forget about that part of my life. It was, there's a lot of pain there in the isolation and not being able to talk about it. I think today it's a bit different. I think people talk about it a lot more, their diagnosis and their treatment.
Probably even a more compelling question is, why did you speak up?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, it's the evolution of Lauren. It's the liberation journey. I mean, to me, my life is a liberation journey. It's learning, and I think I really will be on this journey all of my life to reclaim. I mean, today we were doing our emotional CPR training, and one of the participants talked about peeling an onion. And that's very much how I feel like my life is. I'm always curious and searching and learning about, who I am and what is my capacity? What is your potential and your capacity? And how do we know unless we take risks? And so coming out was a huge risk, but it was coming out from hiding. So it felt very liberating. I had at that point built a lot of support around me. Other people who had the lived experience who had come out, and just other people that understand what it's like to be a marginalized or oppressed group of people, and the importance for us to speak out.
Yeah, I can identify with both of your stories, because when I was hospitalized one time, I was mute, and I wouldn't talk to any of the staff. I talked to the patients, but I wouldn't talk to the staff. And so I can understand how that is,
Didn't feel safe to talk to the staff, probably.
Yeah. the patients are my friends, you know.
They get it.
Yeah. And then also there was a time in my life when I was silent, not totally fine. I mean, my good friends certainly knew what was going on, and people who I worked for knew what was going on, but most other people didn't know at all. And I didn't make it obvious, you know, until I was ready to sort of reorient my life in this direction. So I can identify with both of you.
Yeah. And one of the things that was really important to me, and Dan and I talk about hope, but it was there was a psych tech that just went after me in the sense of he was always talking to me, and at the time I was pretty confused and was hearing voices and seeing things, and the content of the conversation wasn't what it was important. It was that he cared.
Yes, the
And
presence,
yeah. And the other piece for me that was very important is just having people that believed in me. And then, and we've even had this conversation, and I said part of my journey is learning to believe in me.
Yes, yes, yes. Right.
Yeah, we've done research, qualitative research in the National Institute at the National Empowerment Center on the factors that have been most important in people's recovery. Probably 60, 70 stories now of people who, you know, had severe challenges, however we're going to call them, that, and then restored and have a full life, which we do believe is possible. You can have a full life, and often a richer life than other people, in fact, because you have another dimension that other people are never even aware of. But the most frequently used phrase was someone who believed in me. Repeatedly was brought up, and often it was somebody with less training, which to me is a huge indictment of our training system. We need completely to rethink what happens when people are trained, that they lose that element of their humanity, which is most essential to their being able to reach another person. They're told to bury it, they're told not to use it, they're told to...
Boundaries. If the boundaries, I've heard someone say the boundaries are so high that no one ever recovers,
can see over them.
You know, then there's something wrong.
No, that's what ends up happening. There's a wall which prevents the touching of lives. And when you're in acute distress, emotional distress, more than anything and more than any other time, you need to feel that there is another human being out there, and that you matter in somebody else's life. That probably is most essential to life itself. If you don't feel that you touch another life, another human life, or it could be, in my case actually, one time it was a cat. Knowing that I had a cat that needed me. Actually,
I've heard that from a lot of people too. Their pets, taking their dog for a walk is the highlight of their day, you know, for many people.
You know, you're reminding me, I just wanted to share briefly that a few years ago I was at a conference and I met a young woman who was telling me her story. And I took a risk. And I'm not sure if I told her that or not, but I told her that I believed that nothing was ever wrong with her. And I've never said that before to anyone or since. And she immediately responded that made sense, that as she looked back at her life, that she always believed that, but no one had ever told her that. And then I saw her 2 years later. She said it was the most important thing anyone had ever told her.
I want to give you a chance to tell us a little bit more about ECPR. I think you've already told us that the main part of it, or the
origin.
It's just relationships between people. But
this is our workbook. And you can see on the cover there are these two hearts. There's actually a drawing by a consumer from Sweden, and it shows our theme, which is it's really heart-to-heart resuscitation, and it's emotional CPR, which is sort of referring to CPR itself, which is of your physical heart. This is of your emotional heart. And the C is for connecting, the P is for empowering, a little bit of cheating there. And R is for revitalizing, feeling life again, flow through your heart and your mind.
And we start with C. I mean, we go through the C, the P, and the R, but the C we talk about as being the most time-consuming and the hardest element.
Yeah.
Because it really is taking the time to really slow down and listen. A lot of it is about deep listening. It's a letting go of our judgments, our expectations, and joining, being with another person. And, you know, cleaning our lens or clearing our lens to really stand in someone else's shoes or hear on a deep level. It's like it's a heart-to-heart, as Dan was saying. And it's some people today, we're in the midst of a training now, and a woman was talking about how spiritual it was. Very spiritual experience to really...
Yeah, I have the same. What I'd like to do is to tell the audience about some of the resources that they might be able to look into more of this. The Emotional CPR website, www.emotional-cpr.org. That is on your screen. That's this program that we've been talking about that has connecting, empowering, and revitalizing as part of it. Next is the National Empowerment Center, www.power2u.org, which carries a mission of recovery, empowerment, and hope and healing to people who've been labeled with a mental illness. That's what Dan is the executive director of. And finally, the National Coalition for Mental Health Recovery, www.ncmhr.org, that ensures that consumers and survivors have a major voice in the development and implementation of healthcare, mental health, and social policies. And I'd like to suggest to you in the audience that if you or someone you know is dealing with one of these problems, I'd like you to think about what you've heard on the show and maybe check out some of the websites that we've talked about and think about what you might do to incorporate some of this into your life. So thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Dan, for being guests. And I'll close with these words from the Reverend Wayne Arneson. Take courage, friends. The way is often hard, the path is never clear, and the stakes are very high. Take courage, for deep down there's another truth. You are not alone. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.